Well, I just finished reading this book called Dissent. In fact, Why Societies Need Dissent by Cass R. Sunstein. He's a professor at Harvard Law School and also a senior counselor at Department of Homeland Securities, I believe. And he's written an excellent book on a topic which I actually believe a lot in. Also, I'm a proponent of, and I think it's an indispensable element of our society, of our own lives, personal or professional. I really love this book, and I think I'm going to have a lot of takeaways to note down today and talk about. This book was published back in 2005, and I think in the backdrop of whatever was going on in US in terms of a response to the 9/11 and the whole socio-political zeitgeist, the developments after that, and for the lack of, and in fact, I mean that's not the first instance where the lack of dissent or strong ability to listen to the opposing opinion let the whole world get into this vibe of xenophobia towards a particular community or religion and things like that. And that's not the first instance, as is clear anyway. So, talking about dissent, talking about what this topic is and why societies need it, let's focus on that caption for a second. Why societies need dissent? Every word of that quote of that caption carries a lot of weight. First of all, you question. The author is trying to question, why do we need dissent? Second is the societies in general, not just an individual or a company or a sports team or a country. It's about the society in general needs dissent. The third word of that is need. It's not a want, it's not a luxury, it's not a desire or any of those things. It's actually a need, right? We'll expound that and we'll come to see as to what exactly is the need that we're talking about. And last but not the least is the word dissent itself. What is dissent? What are we talking about? And how is it misunderstood versus other synonymous sounding words and concepts, yet the nuanced difference that the author expounds on. In fact, that was something and is something that's going to be the biggest takeaway for me out of this book, because I myself have been guilty of not properly being able to structure my thought around that or differentiate between the different concepts around dissent. Dissent is the ability to present differing ideas from what is at the face of things. Now, delving further, one would look at the different aspects of a particular thing. How do you look at something? Are you looking at something from an objective point of view, from a bird's eye point of view, from a statistical point of view, and so on and so forth? Or are there any biases involved? And how do you question yourself and others? And how do you proposition the whole thing? Now, why do we need, or where do we need it? Firstly, we need it in our personal lives. We need it in our professional lives. We need it in the whole social being that we are, and that's why the word society is there in the caption we talked about. We just don't need it in a personal life because of a limited interest that we have. We also need it in our social lives, in interaction with our neighbors, in interaction with our colleagues, in interaction with our day-to-day living in the society, in the concept, in the polity, in voting and having the right people at the right places and the right kind of changes coming to the whole social fabric of our living. So where does it come from? Is it something new? In my mind, no. It is something which has a very sound historical existence. I'm not sure as to the exact origin, but I can imagine thinking about any species. There is an element of differing in approach and existence from the other species. So dissent, I think, is inherently there in nature. That's why there is evolution, I would say, to that extent, because one form of being differed and dissented in its approach towards living from the other, and that's how the whole growth happened. It's almost like agreeing to the first wheel. If we were to agree to the first wheel that was invented, then there would be no refinement. So in my mind, dissent is the basis of refinement and improving on something which is already in front of us. Historically speaking, even in the Indian context, I think there was this concept whereby a huge verbal debate was organized by the kings and the kingdoms, whereby people would be invited to come and present their ideas and in a way, have a feud about it, or a verbal duel. But the essence of it was to come out with concrete concepts, concrete arguments, so that it makes sense to the larger learned audience, and the winner would be able to uh, gain repute, gain benefit out of it, not only for themselves but also for the larger society. And I think it was called Vad Samvad, but I can double check on that. I don't think I'm exactly able to recollect what the name is, but that's that. Also, when we talk about Dissent, I think we try to teach in the early days of a child's development for them to be able to present their own ideas. We allow Dissent, we allow or encourage them to participate in debates and learn that ability to think, by not conforming. And that's the introduction of another word which the author talks about a lot: conformity. By not just merely conforming to, the ideas that are being suggested to the growing kid, but also think themselves of what suits them, and then, have the ability to dissent and present their point of view, which obviously it's an ongoing process of learning and developing the kid. So we talk a lot about debates and dissent in the early stages of development of a kid. Okay, at the face of it, dissenters might appear to be people who are selfish, or who have their own social interest at play, but and in fact conformists might come across people who are working in the interest of keeping social harmony in place, and protecting the social norms and such. But if you actually just peel down the layer further, you would actually see that the dissenters are actually playing the opposite role versus the conformists, in the larger interest of the social development. Because if there was no ability of general public, or one or a certain percentage of the public, to dissent or differ, there would be no growth, there would be stagnation. So in that sense, dissent is quite important. Let's say a corporate world where we've seen that a lot of wrong has come out from the inability of companies, in fact the larger companies, to allow dissent, by actually becoming autocratic as they become larger and larger, with the decision making concentrated and centralized into one or fewer people, rather than the ability for the lower rung, so to say, in the hierarchy, to have a say, given that they are the ones at the forefront, to have the pulse of what the, let's say, a customer is saying or the market is saying. And that has been the undoing for those larger firms. Classic example would be the banks. They always talk about first line of defense, weakest link, and all those things. But we've seen the amount of penalties the banks had to, shell out for the very fact that they did not have the proper mechanisms in place to allow dissenters and their opinions and their feedbacks and their voice being heard. Another avenue would be military complex. It becomes so centralized with decision making right at the top, and in a way it stops at the presidents of the countries, that countries end up going to war and have insurmountable amount of damage to life, property, and such. So that's the role. And in fact, look at dissent as a dissenter, as a person who's playing devil's advocate. So the person is for the larger interest, but they want to see the loopholes in the arguments, in the process, in the decision making, so that they could prevent future rude shocks. Makes a lot of sense. It's quite practical if you look at it that way. Dissent, according to the author, originates or is affected by to influences, or any sort of an opinion is out of influences. We have a social influence through our learnings, through our experiences in societies, and so do others. And then add to that the complications of social interactions between people. So that brings in power equations, the ability of personalities to influence others, and certain personalities to be influenced by others, and so on. So we have a tendency to follow the crowd. The herd mentality we have seen as a species, it's quite prevalent. The second is and that's an innate ability of humans apparently, to believe in the good that resides in others. So there's an inherent inclination towards that. So what that does is we tend to believe others more than we tend to not believe them, i.e. we tend to go along, rather than question, because that brings in the whole social aspect of the fact that what if we might be seen as rude? What if we are offending somebody? They're not sure if there are other influences and factors in play, but these definitely are something that I've seen in and around at the jobs, at the workplace, in personal life, and I could see that that's what is happening even in the social political sphere. I mean, it's all influences. In fact, to that extent, the whole trend of influencers is what is it? But if not this, that we kind of, to get influenced, we do believe that if the person is showing me a particular product and well, they have done some sort of work on screen and we kind of like them, so we tend to associate that and believe the good in them, and then believe the fact that if they're selling the product or they are vouching for this product, then yes, this must be good. So circles back to this very particular point that the author tries to make. Also, in the way this idea of Dissent works is through this phenomena, or the three phenomena that the author talks about, is of Dissent versus conformity versus social cascades and group polarization. We talk about it, what the author says, and it made a lot of sense to me, at least, that when we talk about Dissent, what we're talking about is to question conformity, right? I think so. Those two influences we talked about are basically talking about conforming to the general ideas and general approach towards topics that are being that is at hand. Now, the other thing is social cascades. So when we get influenced, we tend to align our ideology and speak about them, and thus, consider a cascade. Now, this person is convinced, and they've in social structure, let's say they have more authority, or they have more convincing power, more confidence, better personality, whatever it is. A celebrity, they convince the second person convinces the third. So there's this cascade effect in a social fabric of the society, and that's how ideologies kind of get ideologies spread out through social cascades. And then there is this thing of group thinking and group polarization. So when we are part of a group versus when we are individuals, the mechanics of those two things are very different, because when we sit in the world of isolation, we have nothing but to resort to our own influences, our own experiences to think. But when we are in a group setting, we're bound to be influenced by what others are saying, or in case you tend to be the expert or the convincing, persuading power in that equation, you tend to pursue or persuade the whole group in a certain direction. So that's what the author will talk about. And so the author talks about something called relevant information. So the benefit of Dissent, or the lack of it, is basically around the concept of eliciting the relevant information. While Dissent, in a way, is helping all members of a particular, let's say, a group or a surrounding, be able to share more information and thus logically have a better informed decision at play, versus a group of members who are merely conforming to each other because of, let's say, peer pressure, which is at play, or other factors that we discussed and we would discuss. They would keep certain information to themselves, or the people who are influencing the others are keeping some information to themselves, and thus not everybody is able to kind of arrive to that average average idea or average decision, which would be better than when the information is not shared. So that's one important aspect of around the concept of Dissent and conformity, is the information or the lack thereof, relevant information. It's a process of eliciting more information and thus having a better informed decision. Also, when there is a dominant pressure or a peer pressure or a dominance of conformity in a group, then the whole process kind of gets polluted, and people kind of arrive at a conclusion or jump to conclusion fairly quicker than an actual timed process. And again, that's not that beneficial after all. Also, when there is a dominant view in a group or in a particular decision making, the weaker participant would resort to something called reticence. They would rather keep quiet rather than opening their mouth and becoming the odd factor or embarrassing themselves, for the fear of embarrassment per se, and other social factors at play, such as not offending anybody and everything, and things of that sort that we discussed. Actually, because of fear, hesitation, and other personality traits that a person might have, it becomes difficult for the dissenter, especially a lone dissenter, to disagree with what the general group is saying, or what the trend of the group is, or what reading the room, the pulse of the room is saying, and then they tend to agree with that, because it becomes very difficult for the lone person to make their stance in a group which is a totally different say. We all have experienced something like that. I mean, let's say in a college, if a certain group is agreed to go to the next place, then a place X, then it becomes really difficult for one person to disagree and say, no, we're going to go, or I would like to go to a place Y. Another social or professional occasions might have a similar bearing. Investments, right? In fact, the author expounds this further, that investment groups which have typically had encouraged dissent within the managers, within the investment managers and their discussions, tended to perform better than the investment groups that keep the dissent low. They do not invite diversity and keep the decision making into fewer hands. That or those groups have performed lesser. Something that affects conformity or dissent also, especially conformity, is the presence of financial rewards. The more the financial rewards have a weightage on a person in a group, there is a tendency of an increase in dissent or a decrease in conformity. Also, and this is especially true for another factor which comes into play, is the difficulty of the task. If it's a low difficulty task, then it's easier to get influenced by financial reward and thus have lower conformity. Versus if the task is difficult, the burden of bringing in value increases on every individual, and thus it becomes, or there is a tendency to go along with what the larger group is arriving at. Otherwise the whole burden falls in on everybody else, and that's another factor besides the whole peer pressure and influence or information. The burden of, or the owning the burden of finding irrelevant information and contributing meaningfully to a group or a process of decision making. So financial rewards do alter that level of conformity depending upon the difficulty of the task. In fact, the size of the group matters. If there is a larger group, then there is more influence than a smaller group. And we've seen this, that when more people, a classic example would be let's say a Netflix or a Prime, Amazon video recommendation that's going on. When there are more reviews, even for the restaurants, when there are more reviews, we tend to believe those than when there are less reviews, positive or negative. So the size of the group really influences the ability of others to judge a particular situation or getting influenced or not. So the author talks about the fact that people tend to neglect their own information. So we all know or look at certain things through our own perspectives and experiences, but there's a tendency to not weigh in more on our own information as much as there's a tendency to rely on other people's information, and or on not just information but their judgment and their opinions as well. That kind of that is also seen in the way the courts would or have given their judgments, whereby they've relied upon the lower court's ruling more often than not, because they rely on the information seeking process that the lower courts would have employed in the particular case, and that can cause errors in judgments as well as in a rational approach to delivering justice to the larger society. Now, to prevent this cascading effect of one sort of an opinion taking hold, what is required is a good understanding of the subject at hand and the ability of the members to come up with convincing arguments, to come up with arguments and grounds which can bring others to the same level of understanding, and thus provide a protection against the snowballing effect of one line of thinking to take sway. So that is very important when more informed people are able to present their ideas, and thus they're fairly less influenced by the signals presented by others. Now, this gets complicated further by the amount of influence they carry themselves in that particular setting, right? There would be some people who would have more say or more expertise in certain matter than the others, so they would be able to change the course of or the path of the whole group in a certain manner, or influence them or nudge them in a certain direction, and that comes into play. Also, if you see, while talking about it, that culturally we are in a way encouraged to rely on experts, but that's quite antithetical to the real process that should be at hand, that we should be encouraged, or we should encourage everyone to kind of be skeptical of others and apply your own rational thinking at times. This might be controversial in certain aspects, and we had seen this in the whole debate that arose for vaccines and masks during COVID. Nobody is denying or challenging the expertise of the experts of their own fields, but the whole idea is also to have a dissenting opinion so that the experts and their opinions are also kept in check, and it's not unshackled, or it's free from any sort of an accountability that comes into play. Because if you look at it, there could be serious mistakes and serious errors that in judgment and outcomes that could come out of blinded allegiance or bonds in towards the experts, or even in personal lives. If there's just an affection or a bond which is at play, which could influence the decision making, that might not be in the best interest of the family, of the relationship. And thus, it's always good to have a differing opinion and a dissenting point of view to look at things. Understandably, there is this fear of disrupting the harmony again, but that's a price one has to pay for the larger and a long-term benefit that you can seek out of it. Now, here is where we want to kind of touch base upon the generally confused concepts of dissent versus, or a dissenter versus a contrarian. Now, contrarian is somebody who would fail to disclose their biases, their intent, their objectives, and just refute one line of saying by having a totally opposite point of view. That's a contrarian. I mean, they per se are not helpful in the larger interest, because their only interest is to just have an opposite say. Versus a dissenter who is agreeing to what, who's in line with what the objective of the process is. It's just that they would help in finding the loopholes. So that's a very critical differentiation between the two synonymous sounding but quite different concepts and traits. Also, when we talk about those rewards, the rewards could be not just financial or tangible. They could also be intangible. Something like you have certain exclusion or an inclusion in a group or a membership. So they are also rewards in their own sense that would or might influence your take on certain things, because you would want to be a part of a certain group. And if the qualification or the requirement is to conform, there you go. That kind of prevents you from having a dissenting opinion at the outset. So rewards can be of different natures, not just merely financial or tangible. It's difficult to kind of strike a balance as to how do you conform or not conform while managing a striking balance. It's almost like, how much music did you like? You cannot quantify. There are pieces there are parts within a piece of music which you might like, and there are parts which you might not. But you cannot quantify that you like 10% of the music or 20%. And similar way, you cannot quantify a striking balance between dissent and conformity, but that's something you go with the flow of the whole process, and try and find the best and the optimal contributing factors that you can, or ideas that you can present in a particular discussion towards the decision making. It is because, and it should be originating from the idea that your intent for dissent is because you look at dissent as a tool to improve the decision making process, rather than those other connotations that one could impute, such as trying to have a say, trying to be visible, and all those things. If you truly look at it from an objective point of view and as a tool that would help you arrive at an informed decision making, it really makes sense, and it then transforms or comes into a boundary of cost benefit analysis, because somewhere you are deciding the cost of decision making versus the cost of potential error that it could cause by not presenting your dissenting opinion or being blindsided by it. Well, another thing that the author talks about is the cost of inquiry. Now, conformity would obviously reduce the cost of inquiry, and why is that? Or why do people tend to conform? Is because there is an effort in investigating and finding answers. So the natural tendency would be to rely on the information provided by the others. There are scenarios where the stakes are high, or you may say that the cost of error is so high that the cost of inquiry is outweighed by the consideration for the cost of error or the stakes. And in those scenarios, dissent would be encouraged, and people would tend to share their information. It almost would sound as if we are spiraling into something, because when too many dissenters would come into play, there would be a lot of information being shared. Now, too much information creates the risk of noise and brings in the question of relevant information, right? Which itself would need to pass through the prism of reasonability and rationality to be valid information that can be considered for the requisite decision making. I mean, in larger picture, you're basically talking about cost-benefit analysis. In fact, you would notice that in absence of handy statistical numbers, we tend to resort to heuristics of different kinds, like availability heuristics, right? Which is basically you resort to the information that you heard, hearsay, or you yourself are aware of as a generalization, and you tend to begin to present them as, conclusive arguments, which is erroneous in itself. And because the heuristics could be thrown to, or are basically a function of recent or active memory, or even other social interactions per se. And that's what the author highlights. Another thing is group polarization. So why does a group get polarized? It could be owing to various reasons. It could be because there are different personalities, experts, confident people, bias, bond, affection, or any other, depending on what the semantics of that particular group and the situation is. More confident people would tend to drive the group into a certain direction through their convincing arguments and such. And that kind of, there are situations where we tend to believe that there is a raised awareness in a certain group, it looks like, but make no mistake, there is a possibility, and this is one of the most important aspect that is relevant in today's date, whereby we see a lot of people behaving that they are very aware, but it could just be the conformity to what is already prevalent, the kind of lingo that is in trend. People pick that up and people make it their own. People try to make it sound as if it's their own, because they just picked it up from social interactions. So social interaction could influence your opinions and hence polarize you into a certain direction. So that's one of those. So raised awareness is not necessarily the raised awareness of a group or a person, but it could just be the manifestation of social interactions which is being portrayed by the certain members as if it's their own. That's something we need to be careful of, especially in the way that things are on social media in today's day and age. Another thing is of the size of the group could tends to build more confidence, and we talk about confidence intervals and all in statistics as well. But the size of the group tends to be more correct, and hence the dynamics that the size of the group would bring could really make things very interesting, because there could be emotions at play, and as we discussed, there could be experts at play, there could be confident personalities at play. Now, for instance, confident personalities tend to be more extreme in their views because they are convincing in their own arguments, and they tend to be victim in a way of their own biases. And the more they form their extreme views, the more they become confident, and they just spirals on and on, only for others to witness by that convincing argument more and more, makes them conform, because they would want to just let go of the burden of investigation and cost of inquiry of their own and rely on somebody else who's sounding so correct. Maybe he's correct, so let's go with it. So that tends to be at play in the size of a group when it's larger, and that could cause polarization depending upon the kind of personalities at play in that group dynamics. Also, when we talked about emotions in a group, the emotions are a culprit because they tend to cloud the cognition or the cognitive abilities of most of the members. And if you see, that is what is at play in extreme or extreme groups, extremist groups, because they tend to find common fate or common intergroup personalities to incite more polarized opinions. That's something I think which we see at play in very many examples all across. It could be union protests, it could be left-wing protests, right-wing protests, and so on, because people tend to make it about a certain group rather than just to the merit of individual case and an issue. What else? Quite a lot of relevant pointers in this book, which make sense in the way things are in today's time and age, and makes you just sit back and think as to where we are at fault and what are the elements which we can think on so that we are not falling victims of to conformity or the ideas of conformity by just being a little lazy to prevent ourselves from investigating and finding the information of our own. So that's something we need to, and again, information needs to be relevant, it needs to be devoid of noise as much as it could, and make sense and get us to the reasonable outcomes. Okay, so when we're talking about these groups and group polarization, the size matters. Also, what matters is the initial position or opinion of different people in that group. And if you see, if there is a median in that group, and which means there are extreme opinions as well. Now, the more so it works like this. If it's simple, I think it's more analogous to what we do in simple mathematics of averages. So if the extremes would leave, then the median won't change as much. But if the moderates start leaving, then the moderates are somewhere in between. If they start leaving, then the group tends to get more extreme. That's a very valid point. And that is what tends to happen, because people get frustrated and they just want to give up and be like, all right, if things cannot change and I cannot contribute to a change because I can see the whole group getting polarized into a certain direction, it just makes people to get the first answer that comes to mind is, all right, I can pursue my alternatives rather than trying to convince a group which has made up their mind quite as much. So when the moderate members leave, the residual group tends to be more extreme, and which is of quite a bit of concern, especially in the scenarios where it's a matter of the whole society. When we talk about these members, right, if even in the corporate world, when we're trying to make a team work, obviously there will be different personalities at play and so on. For the team to be effective, it also makes sense that the team is diverse, right? Diversity brings a better average of ideas or better concurrence of ideas. So what is required for the team to be effective is not just extreme positions, but median position, moderate positions as well, and people bringing in a lot of information diversity with them. Not diversity of just backgrounds, but what is your contribution eventually would make a difference. Now that's a key difference. Right? We talk a lot about diversity, but we don't talk about what diversity should contribute. Now this is what is important. The diversity of information will make things more effective to have the meaningful contribution into that decision-making process. And this is what is mostly seen as a problem in corporate world, per se, at least. That's what I feel, that there is this forcibly created illusion of unanimity through the idea of team spirit and teamwork and team cohesiveness and all that. It's almost as if people are forced into having a unanimous consensus idea towards a particular thing that can spiral a group or a team towards one extreme outlook or a position. That's something I think is very common practice that I do not know, because it almost sounds like teamwork is opposite, or a consensus building is almost opposite to what we're discussing, that Dissent is required. Because if it's too much of consensus in things and there's an encouragement towards that direction deliberately, then it changes the dynamics, definitely. Now, the author also talks about a lot towards the end of the book on the free speech, how it is related in terms of the polity and social standing of, let's say, a country like the US, and how the design of the American Constitution was envisioned by those who designed it. It was to create a deliberative democracy which has accountability and reflection. It bifurcated or prevented or created safeguards against the idea of conformity or polarization by having, let's say, bicameral legislature, Senate, Congress. Even beyond that, it also is about a judiciary or a judicial arm which would be a check further on the powers of, or the kind of legislation that is being passed, if it is ultra vires or unconstitutional. Now, similarly, and obviously, I mean, president's power are also curtailed, and that is the key difference between dictator or dictatorial countries versus, let's say, a democracy or democratic countries. So even in US, the president's power are curtailed or limited, as, for instance, the president has to seek approval of the Congress for waging a war or approving or passing a particular bill or legislation. If you see, in fact, enshrined in the Constitution, there's a lot that gets talked about the free speech, or in fact, the right to privacy. Basically, the right to privacy. It's so key. It's such a key regulation in itself, or a protection. This is the first time I actually came across something like this, or a perspective like this, and I think this is going to be a big takeaway for me. So right to privacy allows people to escape reputational pressures and insulate from conformity. What a statement. I think this kind of sums up this book for me, because I actually never looked at privacy and the right to privacy with such uh, such a bird's eye view, while at the same time you're almost able to have a sonar imaging of the depth of this statement. I don't know. It's quite a deep one, that it is allowing you to escape reputational pressures and insulate you from conformity. It is preventing you from a lot of pressures. You can just stay in your own private, understanding your private space and create, or have freedom to think the way you want to think, access books, read, interact, if you may, in your privacy with whosoever you want to, formulate ideas, question them on your own. What a brilliant amount of thought would have gone for somebody to have, designed this nuance. I appreciate it today. I mean, before this, I understood superficially, I would say, the right to privacy and its importance, but this is the best way I've come across that this could be put. When we talk about different personalities that play in a group, the author talks a lot about how even the courts and the legal system and the judges are influenced, and you would see that there is a considerable amount of influence by judges over each other, and they do conform to the majority opinion at times, which basically highlights this. And if it is happening in that learned group of people, it is quite prevalent in the rest of the society, that it could change or it could dampen the ideology. It could change or alter your idea of certain aspect of society or an opinion, depending upon what your peers are talking about. In fact, the author highlights the widespread social convictions are likely to influence anyone who lives in society, and that includes judges. The author further highlights that even the liberal champions of constitutional equality, they expressed interest, for instance, in gay rights only in the 1980s, long after the gay rights movement had already found real progress in the nation, and not before. So that goes to show that the legal system in itself has certain flaws which arise from the ideas somewhere oscillating between conformity and dissent. When there is too much conformity, there is a problem of group polarization and a polarization in certain direction. When there is too much dissent, there could be absolute stalemate, and there is no progress of society either. And we've seen that happening in a lot of court cases as well. For instance, sex discrimination, affirmative action, race and gender equality, and all those things. Another point that the author highlights is that dissent should not be confused with diversity, or diversity should not be confused with dissent. As we discussed earlier, diversity is good, but then it matters what that diversity contributes. If there is an information diversity by that diverse group, then there is a meaningful contribution. By just the presence of that diversity in a group, it might not really create fruitful outcomes. And that's, I think, is the biggest debate even in the affirmative action issue in the society currently, and which has always been the case, that what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about a diverse set of people in a particular let's say, an educational institution or university or a program? Are we talking about just having presence of diverse backgrounds, or are we actually talking about their experiences and their contributions, that would be the information that they would contribute into the cohort, let's say, in which they get admission to? This is what helps us think deeper and better as to how to, what stance to take in this whole debate. Otherwise, we are all just, some of us just, at least I'm talking about myself, I would just, at times be influenced by one set of arguments, and then almost influenced by another set of arguments at times. But then, this book kind of gives me the perspective of understanding the fact that diversity, we're talking about diversity in admissions, but what are we actually talking about? We're talking about bringing in more information with people from diverse backgrounds. They'll bring in more experiences to that group, to that cohort, and that would contribute to a better outcome for all of the people, at least in that cohort, for that year, and even more, because the interactions are, they keep going on. Towards the end, I think the author just talks about a lot about the free speech, why and how we need it. It's a protection against the tendency of the society to impose one set of conduct on everybody else. And to have that protection, we need right to privacy, right to free speech, and we need to be possessive about those rights per se, because within those protections and safeguards is how we can progress into or towards a direction where we will be better beings, first and foremost, and secondly, we'll be able to improve our decisions by having a rational thinking of cost benefit analysis and cost of inquiry versus cost of error for the future, right? In fact, Dissent, coming back to it, I mean, the whole gist of it being that Dissent is required, and we see that dissenters are actually, doing more justice for the long-term benefit of the society by bringing in a safeguard to question the status quo and the blindsidedness of a group and preventing them from getting polarized. This includes people who contribute from different fields and domains, something like, let's say, stand-up comedians. They contribute by questioning or making it or keeping it out in the open, the ideas and the discussions which people otherwise tend to avoid, relying on certain experts. But stand-up comedians, kudos to them, they question those polarized beliefs at times by saying the unsavory things, and they have their own history, because there used to be something like court jester or a king's jester who used to be allowed or permitted this authority of at least making fun and joke around. So there's also this a lot of reference in this book, by the way, about on this story that we're quite familiar with, the Emperor's Clothes story. And well, thanks to the ability to dissent or see things differently and have the courage to stand up and speak by the kid, that the emperor eventually realized the reality of things, and the fact that he was blindsided or kept in the dark by his own trusted ministers, so to say. So that's a rude shock, and that's what the dissenters could prevent as a contribution to the group. Another point I was thinking is dissent, if I could compare, has, from the social science, has a parallel in the physical science. In physics, if you see, it's opposing forces which are at play and which are very necessary. Classic example, friction. It's only because of the opposing forces that cause friction that we are able to walk. In absence of those, it would be a very slippery slope, and we don't want to be falling victim to that, pun intended. So dissent helps you attack political correctness, the status quo, gets things moving, churn ideas, act as a catalyst. It's, in my mind, it's quite indispensable, and it's quite contrarian, or it's quite contrary. I'm sorry, see again that bias. It's quite contrary to the ideas that are generally prescribed, let's say, in companies, that we need to be cohesive, we need to get along, we need to look in the same direction and have consensus and all that, which is all good as long as we're not being blindsided, which we typically are. In fact, we always need to look for that lapse in the process, and that's how you can at least contain the rude shocks and harm and an unforeseen outcome. Anyways, that's dissent comes from skepticism in my mind. That's what I think, and dissent would be indispensable in more scenarios than we would imagine. Dissent in my mind is quite important, and it is something that brings value in a group. It has nothing to be. It is not something which is to be seen as a tool to offend somebody, but as a pure tool to have or develop an objective thinking in the larger interest of a group. And it could be any sort of group. It could be a military team. It could be a corporate team. It could be family, friendship, and so on. So I'm going to take a lot of takeaways from this book and think a lot on this, and develop my objectivity and ability to have good dissenting viewpoints or arguments and not be blindsided or polarized. I think that's that. Interesting book, short read, published in 2005. As I said, I'm trying to find the other book of this author called The Worst Case Scenarios. I'm sure it's going to be as interesting a read. There are a couple of other books as well, but that's the next one which I'm going to try and hunt and find it, get my hands on, and read through. That's that. Hopefully I'll be able to finish another book and make another video log of it as soon as possible. This has been an interesting read. I really enjoyed it. Couldn't keep down the book before I finished it, and I'm really happy I was able to pick it through from the heap of books and some gems, hidden gems. This is one of them. All right, thank you, and See you soon.